Hi, and welcome back to another video feature of the Immersive Worlds Handbook. Today I'm taking a tour of Phantasialand, and specifically what I want to do in this video feature, I'm doing a couple on Phantasialand, some of the attractions, some of the overarching issues. In this particular video, I want to focus on the issue of cultural representation. And I'm looking at the brochure that I picked up when I visited Phantasialand, and quite specifically I had a chance to look at two of their themed hotels, and I had a chance to tour these with some of the participants from the Bonn Theme Park Studies group that I'm a part of. This was in 2018. So there are two theme areas to look at in this respect. One is the themed hotel Lingbao. So this is an Asian themed hotel. And then the second one is the Matamba, which is an African themed hotel. And just right there, I think saying Asian themed and African themed, we identify maybe one of the issues with theming when you get into cultural representation, and that is the sense that you create a theme space based on a lot of iterations or instances of a variety of different cultures, nations, or people. You amalgamate those and put them in one form, and that's always a challenge with any kind of theme space that has some direct referent or reference point in the world that you're basing your theming on. Now, they have a pretty good write-up here on the two themed hotels, and I thought it might be interesting to just read the first part of this because this is their introduction to their themed hotels. Fancy immersing yourself in the magic of Africa or the Zen of the Far East after a visit to our park? Not a problem. Germany's best theme park is not only home to exhilarating rides and incredible shows, it is the ideal location for a fantastic mini break with the entire family. Our extraordinary themed hotels Lingbao and Matamba offer adventures both young and old, fun, enjoyment, and relaxation at their best. So, simply drop by on the spur of the moment and extend your stay into an extra special mini break at the Phantasialand Resort. And it goes into some description here. I'll probably read these later on some voiceover. I want to show you some video and also some stills of these two themed hotels. In addition to that, though, I would reference the theme park map. And specifically, I wanted to also talk about some of the other themelands. So not all of the themelands necessarily focus on cultural representations or place-based representations. In fact, you'll note there are two, fantasy, and probably we'll talk about these in another video, and mystery. And those don't have a very specific place-based association. There is actually some original IP with the Winja in the fantasy themeland, and then in mystery as well, you get some original IP in there in those two themelands. And the place-based themelands include Mexico, Berlin, and as I previously mentioned, the two we'll really focus on is China and also Africa. They call it deep in Africa, and China is actually called Chinatown. So again, there's some play here with place-based association. But I want to focus on China and Africa because I had the longest opportunities to spend some time in those themelands, to look at the hotels. And it's in those two hotels that I just talked about where really you have the most developed theming. I'll take you through some of the theming and some of the attractions in the other themeland, in the other themed area as well. But the hotels, I think, have that sense of rich immersiveness that we often expect with theming that has a place-based association. So throughout this video, we'll address issues of cultural representation, we'll talk about stereotyping, we'll talk about exoticism, and I'd like to use this almost as a seminar to ask some questions about, is it okay to represent other cultures, other nations, other places, and people? If the answer to that is yes, the secondary question is, if it's okay, what sort of conditions apply to the representation? In other words, are we required to represent those cultures in very specific ways? Should we show diversity? Should we show nuance? What happens if we show something in our representations and visitors maybe pick up on what they think is a stereotype, a sense of cultural essence or even cultural essentialism. So these are some questions to ask today, so we'll use this pedagogically to really create some understandings about the rights and wrongs of doing the type of thing that we see here at Phantasialand. So let's begin the tour now with some footage and photography that I shot while on site at the theme park. All right, so we'll begin the tour here at Lingbao, and this is again part of the Chinese or Asian theme land here at Phantasialand. And our group, as I mentioned from the Theme Park Studies Conference, had a chance to do a tour of both of the themed hotels at the end of our visit to Phantasialand. And so we'll look at some of the insights that we gained during the trip. Now, I was recently looking at reviews of the hotel, and this one I think sums up maybe for me one of the concerns we might have. The title here is Asia in Europe. They're describing Lingbao. And I think, certainly on the one hand, you could say there is maybe an innocence in place-based theming like this. We'll talk about Hotel Matamba as well. But the question is, should we feel innocence when we're in a place like this? Again, the politics of cultural representation that we're getting into today, I think, are very intense and, of course, open to high levels of debate. I guess what maybe happens with Asian, and in this case Chinese, representation is that there's a little bit more of a connotation with high culture, with the arts, with sophistication in terms of the architecture, the decor, the design. So maybe that's one issue for us to address today, is it would be essentially the consequences of our representations. And of course, all of our representations are based in, real, fictive, simulated, imaginary, and actual places. And there's an old saying by Wayne Curtis that says basically when you have a representation of something, often it's how something feels to you, or how it appears to you, or the recollection that you have of something. So it's something to keep in mind as we think about culture and place-based theming. So this is inside the hotel room, and from what I understand, it's a very renowned hotel. I think it's a 5-star hotel. They have a spa and everything, and we toured the grounds, and it was certainly very, very impressive. Now you see images like this, and I find this happens a lot in place-based theming, where you have maybe actual historic photos of individuals, but they serve like a decor purpose, and I think it almost says something about the context and the politics of representations. In a sense, you are using place and real people and identities, but you're stripping it out of context and you're repurposing the entirety of what you're doing. I've called this in other work culture sampling, because I feel in some respects we often use these approaches in many of our theming projects, whether they're those of theme parks or those of hotels. And near the end of our stay, we actually also took a look at the themed buffet, which was another part of this very large hotel complex here at Phantasialand. Okay, so we can leave Asia and enter Africa, which I think maybe sounds a little bit ridiculous and kind of one of the points of this video. You recall actually that Epcot, there are many representations of world cultures and different places and people and identities in many theme parks. And I recall years ago watching in the 90s, it was a promotional video for Epcot, and one of the guests in the video says they liked Epcot so much because as they went from one country to the next, the accents changed as you visited the next place. And I think that's one of the points, right, with representations in theme parks, is that you can have an amalgamation of many different cultures, and the guest presumably can deal with the contradictions, or can deal with the lack of authenticity, or some of the stereotyping, as we'll talk about today. I've got some weird artifacting on my camera going on, and then also the exposure was a little off, but I think you'll get the idea of some of the representations here. So one of the things that you see with both Lingbao and Hotel Matamba is they also have theme lands connected. And the Africa theme land here is pretty extensive and much newer than the Asian theme land. And one of the things to think about when you look at any representation in a theme park, in terms of cultures and places, is to what extent I don't want to say like, are those representations accurate, but what do they draw on? And I think that's one of the questions. For example, if you look at old Westerns, the old Western tradition, you always had Plains Indians represented. And so, over time, stereotypes develop because we see the same images of certain people or the same symbols or the same representations or reference points with those symbols and so forth. And we'll talk about this today. So I think it's one of the things to consider is maybe not should places such as Africa, and again, it's an entire continent, should all that diversity be represented in some of the ways that we see it represented here at Phantasialand. A little bit later, I'll take you to Disney's Animal Kingdom Lodge, and I think they do things a little bit different there. I mean, it's a little, I think, more higher capital project in terms of their investments. We're again looking here at Phantasialand. And also, when you go into Harambe, it's this fictional version of an African village, if you will. So it's like one of the issues I think to think about today is the source points for some of these representations. Now you'll see a woman walking here, and we had a conversation, some of us, and it was about, and we're looking inside a gift shop here, and it was about the fact that it appeared that all the workers in the Africa theme land were dark-skinned. We also see the black mamba ride here, so we're getting into some nature representations that I think it would be worthy of discussion as well. But as you look at some of the art here, that's an interesting question to say, like, is that ethical? Is that even bordering on racist if you have that kind of representation of workers in one theme land? So something for us to unpack in the future. Now this I found interesting, and we talk about authenticity. So this is an African restaurant in the African theme land, and you could get jambalaya and falafel. Now falafel, I think, is one of those like vegetarian meals that sometimes gets stripped out of, say, like a Mediterranean or Israeli context, and is used as a generic, vegetarian option. But jambalaya is probably not what you'd expect to see in an African theme land. Now, had it said African stew or something like this, a little bit different. You were looking there at one of the patinas on one of the corrugated metal structures. Will move into Hotel Matamba here outside of, or it's part of the theme land, and I think we'll continue to ask some questions here about the nature of the representations we see here. One of the before we do that, though, here are my 3 slides of Disney's Animal Kingdom Lodge, and I include these because I want to say that, like, African cultures do get represented in theme parks rather extensively, but I think in this case you see it's a much higher level of design, and of course Disney has the capital to be able to pull off some of the things they do here. Even their African art, and I have a separate video on Animal Kingdom Lodge, but their African art exhibit is considered one of the best in the world, according to Disney and their representation. So something to think about in contrast maybe a little bit with Phantasialand. So here's a representation outside the hotel, and you see an elephant, and this is one of the things that I think becomes part of the maybe complex of stereotyping of, say, African cultures and African nations, the entire continent of Africa, is the association with nature and not thinking about the diversity of ecosystems, or in this case, association with particular forms of art. Masks, for example, get represented, it seems like, very extensively in a lot of these portrayals that we see. And this reminds me of a bit of a point in culture history. I actually discussed this in my unpublished paper in culture sampling. I get into a little bit the history of primitivism. So primitivism is a movement in art and in culture in which individuals like Gauguin or Picasso maybe went to Tahiti or African cultures or particular places where they brought back the sense of the primitive, the exotic, and they represented that in various forms of art. Now, on the one hand, there was sort of like an interest in this because it seemed like we were mixing sampling and resampling culture. But on the other hand, the concern becomes, is this a form of the colonial gaze? Is this a form of exoticism? So something to think about in terms of that history of primitivism. So now we're inside Hotel Matamba. There are some restaurants here we'll take a look at. One of the things I found interesting was every nook and just every corner of this hotel had some object or artifact. And at some level, I thought maybe it was just too much, the density of objects. And it's almost like that density and the lack of maybe some subtlety or some spacing. Here's a bathroom that had some of this kind of interesting bricolage art, which is certainly part of, African cultures. But, again, we have to think about what are the context, the ethics of some of these representations here. But that density of the artifacts, of the displays, of the artwork, I think you'll see this as you move through. There's more of the bricolage canisters here that you see represented in one of the back areas during a tour in which we looked at actually one of the conference rooms. I mean, there's some nice design here, don't get me wrong, but just look at what you see there and just look at how many artifacts are actually represented there. Now we'll look at some more accoutrements here, and I should say when we got our tour of the conference room, which you'll see in a bit, the woman was explaining that all of the artifacts that you see, we're getting more of that nature motif, the leopard skin stuff that you're seeing here. I believe you'll see a waitstaff person later with a similar outfit, but this particular individual told us that and the word she said in German, some of the German speakers said, and here's our tour, that it was an accurate translation. She actually said, we have a village in Africa. And apparently what happens in Africa is when you have a craftsperson who creates objects like these, over time, like other people, food and living areas sort of develop over time in this village area. And there's that worker there, which, again, looking at this, I just wonder if some of these representations get more, I don't want to say into the realm of kitsch, but they maybe get a little too stereotypical in terms of some of even the colors and designs and the patterns and so forth. We're back into the conference room. So what was interesting about what this woman said was this sort of, notion we had, almost like a colonialist gaze, where it's like, we have our own village in Africa. So there's a lot to unpack here in terms of not just what's represented here, but the creation, the trade, if you will, the creation of these artifacts and design schema that are then brought here to Phantasialand, just outside of Cologne, Germany, near Bonn as well. Again, here's the outside. Again, you see this density of artifacts, of architectural design choices and so forth. There is actually like a children's play area just to the right of this. I'm not sure if I have any representations here. But so I think, my sensibility talking with the other theme park participants in our seminar was, there were more concerns about Matamba and the African themeland than, say, Lingbao and the Asian or Chinese themeland. So it's something to think about in terms of just maybe which representations become prevalent and reproduced over time, and how those maybe carry with them certain stereotypes or forms of essentialism, essences of culture. So this is another representation in some of their Mexican theming you see. So there is, significant amount of place-based theming, and you also see so you see some posters here, representations as well. And we had a chance to look at, there's some Mayan imagery, Telecon, this interesting spinning ride, and you see just some of the glyphs and representations there. And we had a chance actually to sit and watch this, and one of our participants is a scholar of theater studies, and she spoke very extensively just about the staging that goes on in this particular ride. You can't see it from this perspective, but it's a pretty intriguing ride. Now I should say, beyond Phantasialand, we can step outside a little bit. There's also Europa Park, which unfortunately in 2018 just had a major fire. But this is from some of their African theming. When I look at this, again, I think this is maybe not the best portrayal of an African culture. Same thing here. You get these gigantic versions of vessels and these masks. They're sort of sunk in. They have this like almost caricature kind of sensibility to them. And as we saw at Phantasialand, representations of Africa, jungles, elephants, monkeys, primates, and so forth. Now, to contrast that with Iceland, you don't see these representations. This is again is at Europa Park, and these are some of my images. So I just sort of asked to you, the viewer, some questions about what are the ethics of representing culture, and places and peoples in theme park landscapes. And then, what are some of the differences and how different cultures, people, and places are represented. Now, I was reading an article recently on tropical islands, which is just outside of Berlin, Germany. I visited it quite a few years ago. And here are some of their representations. And I read this article and I thought it maybe took it a bit far, but the article was suggesting that because Germany has a history of hate crimes and ethnocentrism and xenophobia in some regards, in terms of some of its political movements, this explains tropical islands. Now, I did see this while I was there. It was a Cuban performance, and it almost, for me, took on the character of minstrelsy, which sort of caricatures of culture. They all said surf shops with sharks, and presumably maybe that represents like the US or something, a surfing culture. So there was an amalgam of different cultures represented. Sometimes when I see, religious iconography, Buddhas or other representations of Eastern traditions, I sometimes wonder about those as well and say like, well, what are the ethics of representing what potentially could be sacred symbols in theme park spaces? So a lot to unpack here at Tropical Islands. And here we go again, we have the African jungle. So this is a very clear identification of Africa being associated with the jungle, dark Africa, the dark continent, as you maybe remember from Busch Gardens. And this is a representation on one of the doors, which again, I think sort of presents that imagery of a very tall Nilotic person, imagery of nature and so forth. Now, even at Disney, at Animal Kingdom, you see some of this. So you see drums. Drums often get associated with African cultures when they're represented in theme parks. And then you can see the Kodak picture spot. This is actually from 2008, I want to say. Remember your visit to Africa. So, a cultural theorist would say, well, you're not really going to Africa. And that's really one of the points, I think, for our considerations today as we jump back to one final image of Phantasialand. I guess I would just encourage you to offer some comments here on YouTube about your own sensibilities about the ethics of cultural representations that we see in theme parks like Phantasialand. Is it okay to have these representations? If so, what are some of the parameters of the representation, and what are some checks and balances that can be made in terms of design sensibility about the cultures and places and people portrayed? So questions to ask here today at Phantasialand. So I hope you enjoyed the video feature today, looking here at cultural representation at Phantasialand, just outside of Bonn, Germany. I hope you had an opportunity to really reflect on some of the issues that are entailed when a theme park decides to represent another culture, place, or people in a theme park attraction, in a themed hotel, or another space. So please do come back for additional video features of the Immersive Worlds Handbook.